Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs, presented today by ServPro. Interesting conversation coming up for us. One of the most respected national analysts who kind of always emerges this time of year. Well, he has, I think, identified what might be the top advantage for Georgia on the field here for this season. We're going to talk to you about why that matters on today's program. Also, a completely different voice in the sport has given Kirby Smart a pretty big compliment. We'll talk about what that means and why that's relevant here today. New reasons to be mad at the Florida Gators. We'll give you that. A little bit of a recruiting piece of information. We'll give you that there as well, too. Probably not all that related to Georgia, but, maybe you never know. I don't know. We'll see about all of that. And also on a Tuesday, special appearance by Mike Griffith on today's program, because we got some DawgNation folks sort of shifting around, taking a little bit of vacation. So we will shift around with them and alter our guest schedule here just a little bit. So we are fully loaded, heading towards a July 4th holiday, but no sense of slowdown on our part at all. Just as jam-packed as ever here on this particular Tuesday. So we're glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro. Cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
When it comes to being a Georgia fan and thinking about the upcoming season, there is one thing that I have sort of put my faith in more so than anything else as to why I believe that Georgia can be best team in the country again and perhaps once again win the national championship. And for all the talk of, hey, the fact that Carson Beck might be, as a returning starting quarterback, the Heisman Trophy winner, maybe the number one overall draft pick, because of kind of an interesting collection of wide receivers that Georgia has, perhaps a reinvigorated Georgia running back room, kind of return to form for the Georgia defense. There are all these things you can discuss, and obviously over the course of the last few weeks and in the weeks to come prior to the start of the upcoming season, we will discuss all of those things. But I really do believe that if you want to zero in on the one advantage that Georgia might have that truly separates it from all of its competition, I think it may be this, that Georgia has the best offensive line in America. And we obviously, I think, have an understanding here that the offensive lineman, or I should say the offensive line overall, the offensive line is a lever that just has the ability to make everything better. It's good to have a good quarterback, but a good quarterback playing behind a great offensive line is made even better. It's obviously good to have good running backs, but a collection of running backs playing behind a great offensive line makes that group even better. In fact, if you want to kind of zero in on Trevor Etienne for a moment, there are a lot of Georgia fans who have very high expectations for Trevor Etienne, but if we're looking at this just on the basis of what he's done so far in his Florida career, you might have a hard time identifying a stat line that proves he's going to be a great player at Georgia. That if you have this thought that Etienne's going to be a big part, I'm talking about a significant part of Georgia's story here this season, part of the discussion has to be why he will be better at Georgia than he was at Florida. He was a fine player at Georgia. He was among the better running backs in the SEC, but probably like a top 10 level running back or something along those lines. There are some Georgia fans who think he can be even better this year. Once again, if that's true, the greatness of the offensive line would sort of suggest that is the reason why that could be. Same thing for the pass catchers, the need to replace Brock Bowers. Very difficult question to answer about how does Georgia replace the production that Brock Bowers was responsible for. But once again, if the offensive line is what we think it can be, then that task of replacing Brock Bowers would seem to also get just a little bit easier. Now, you can hear me say this, and I guess to a certain extent, hopefully you believe me, and in many ways our opinions are probably already aligned, but every now and then it's also nice to have others sort of validate the same thing there as well. We are in magazine season. The Athlon Sports magazine's been on newsstands. The Lindy's has been out there. And around this sort of time, kind of the middle part of the summer, heading to the month of July, that's when the Phil Steele magazine comes out. And I don't know that Phil Steele is my favorite of the magazines, but Phil Steele is probably the most well-known person who sort of publishes the magazine. It is a ponderous a volume to read. The font is, pretty small. It's not always the most, I would say, user-friendly experience out there, but it's a pretty well-known magazine. And Phil Steele is a respected national analyst. So in one of his rankings there for his magazine, and I also saw this at on3.com, so we'll throw this on the screen from them. When he ranks his top 25 offensive line units ahead of the 2024 college football season, Phil Steele has Georgia at number 1. So there you go. We've been saying for a while that we thought that might be Georgia's top strength. And a guy like Phil Steele, who's not a Georgia fan, kind of outside the bubble of DawgNation, he also kind of helps validate for us that Georgia may truly have the best offensive line in America. Now, I'm going to, in a moment, kind of get to why offensive line in particular might be so important in terms of a top strength for Georgia. But let's also kind of zero in on this just a little bit more, how remarkable it might be that Georgia truly does have that best overall unit. First of all, one of the things you're going to hear a lot about in the months to come is the possible emergence of Ernest Green. Green, I think a year ago, was certainly a very good player for Georgia, a very important building block in the overall offensive success of UGA. But in this upcoming season, you are led to believe that Green is probably about to take that next step. And it won't just be people like me talking about Ernest Green. It's going to be people like Mel Kiper and, Daniel Jeremiah and the most respected NFL draft scouts. There are a list of players at Georgia who have a realistic chance of being the number 1 overall pick in the 2025 NFL draft, and Green would be one of them. Green would certainly be projected to be a first-round pick, and perhaps even better than that. So on the list of why it is that Georgia, according to Phil Steele, would be the number 1 offensive line, the presence of a guy like Green playing the left tackle spot is one of the reasons why he might be the single best prospect in the country when it's all said and done. Mikael Williams, Carson Beck, there are also guys sort of vying for that same type of discussion, but that's just sort of where this is here right now. A big-time presence of a guy like Green makes this true. Something else that's important about the overall discussion of the Georgia offensive line is a returning starter and a veteran presence like Tate Ratledge. Ratledge is one of those dudes that on some teams in some situations may be going to get the NFL payday and kind of leaving Georgia behind or leaving his college home behind. That's just one of those things would perhaps happen. But we kind of see this at Georgia pretty frequently. And it was like Warren Brinson and Nazir Stackhouse, sort of this version of that on the defensive side of the ball. We've seen other Georgia teams in previous years have this same type of thing. Maybe Cedric Von Prawn Granger was an example of this a year ago, where you could go to the NFL, you could earn that NFL payday, but either because you just really like college or perhaps you've got the NIL in place or whatever the reasons are, a veteran like this who could be in the NFL chooses to come back to Georgia for one more go of it. Georgia fans were very happy to have Van Pran a year ago. I believe they'll be very happy to have Tate Ratledge returning for Georgia here this season. In addition to that, speaking of Van Pran, this was a guy who seemed to man the center position. I mean, doesn't it seem like about 10 years that Van Pran was Georgia's starting center? And, the Bulldogs have sort of had a, top-level center for a long time. Not an easy position to replace. But let's go back and think about all the things that Kirby Smart would have said about Jared Wilson, the likely replacement for Van Pran, during spring practice. Of all the players that, were kind of participating in Georgia spring practice, in a lot of ways, Kirby was as complimentary of Wilson as he was almost anyone. Not an easy replacement for someone like SVP, who played that position at such a high level, but that's the kind of, praise that Wilson was earning. So another reason why Georgia may have the top offensive line in America for the upcoming season is because they had the presence of the offensive line depth. When a guy like SVP moved on, Georgia was able to move a guy in Wilson who seems to be more than ready to handle that position. Most teams in America just simply don't have that level of offensive line depth, which sort of brings me to the other spot I want to highlight here for a moment. If you really want to look and see what makes the Georgia offensive line so different than so many of the other offensive lines in America, look at what we're going to see kind of happening over there at the left guard spot, the battle that we expect to sort of take place there, where Georgia certainly has two starter-level players. And these are a couple of guys that could both potentially be like all SEC-level players. But as it stands right now, it's going to be a competition for playing time between a guy like Dylan Fairchild, who has started and played well, a guy like Micah Morris, who has been certainly getting playing time and seemingly earning positive reviews when he's been in there. Two guys that sort of bring that requisite toughness that you want the offensive line to be all about. The fact that Georgia has at least 6 and probably 7 or 8 offensive linemen who could truly play at a high SEC level starter capacity here, that is just a level of depth that most programs cannot match. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a good thing that Georgia is believed to have the best offensive line in America for the upcoming season. But let me also take this to a slightly, different place here for a moment. And this is a point you've probably heard us make before if you watch or listen closely on a regular basis. Having the best offensive line is especially important in college football right now because for whatever reason, this is not a position group that you can very easily go out and kind of fill some gaps and cover up some holes in the transfer portal. That is just not proven to be a very easy thing to do. The best offensive linemen seem to stay where they sign out of high school, and they go through that program, they end up in the NFL. You are not repopulating your offensive line and making up for your recruiting misses in the transfer portal when it comes to the offensive line. So therefore, if you have a deficit in terms of what your offensive line is compared to the teams that you're competing with, it's very hard to make up that gap. The best example of this is that the team that we've probably talked about the most this offseason as being in contention with Georgia for this year's national title, the team that's going to be ranked in all likelihood second behind Georgia in the Associated Press and the coaches' preseason polls when they come out, Ohio State. Did you know that Ohio State on this list from Phil Steele in terms of the top offensive line in America, did you know that Ohio State's only 12th in that list? And once again, this is just like one man's opinion, so who's to say what the truth ends up being? But if you want to zero in on the importance of the offensive line, the fact that, Georgia has the best offensive line, the fact that the team that's sort of thought to be competing alongside Georgia for the national title, Ohio State, the fact that they're only 12th best, that gap between those two programs at this position, that may explain as much as anything else as to why Georgia ought to be viewed as the favorite to win this year's national title. The same thing for teams that Georgia's playing in this year's regular season. Phil Steele's got Ole Miss at 13th. He's got Alabama at 16th. You think about a team like Kentucky, who's also kind of thought to be kind of a tricky road game for Georgia. They're only 17th on this list. So when Georgia goes and battles these teams that it's playing on the road, when Georgia perhaps gets ready to battle Ohio State in the college football playoff, the perceived advantage that Georgia has along the offensive line may prove to be one of the most important factors in that game. So a guy like Phil Steele, he's a respected national analyst. This is a guy whose voice has had a lot of weight around the sport for a long time. He says Georgia, best offensive line in the country. To be frank, a lot of Georgia fans have gotten very used to hearing compliments about their team during this portion of the offseason. But there are some phrases that matter more so than others. And there are some platitudes that just carry a little bit of extra weight. When you really want to lean on what could be the big differentiator for Georgia and why it could navigate a regular season schedule that's perhaps tougher than any that Georgia's ever played, and why it could be once again set up to perhaps win the national championship once again, center in on that offensive line. It's a position group where Georgia might be the best, and that advantage might propel the Dogs to success once again here in 2024. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by our friends at ServPro. We are happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m. across all platforms, radio, Anthem Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com, Apple, Spotify, everything else. Just happy to have you with us there on that. And a huge thanks to our friends at ServPro who make it all possible. And listen, when it comes to a big mess, a mess caused by fire or water intrusion or any of these things that just leave you with a huge, ugly mess to clean up, our friends at ServPro are the name you want to know if you find yourself dealing with that very challenging circumstance, because the folks at ServPro are restoration specialists. And I love that, because if you've had damage to whether it's the home you live in or the commercial property where your business is housed, or perhaps a rental property, if you've had some damage done to that property, you want it restored. You want it put back, and frankly, you want it put back like it never even happened. If you could wave a magic wand and sort of make it all kind of disappear, the damage, and sort of reappear in its previous form, that's what you'd want to do. Well, guess what? The folks who can do the next best thing in terms of actually making that be the case are our friends at ServPro. Their restoration specialists want to do just that for you. Each and every franchise also independently owned and operated there as well, so you're doing business with folks who have just as much of a vested interest in the outcome as you do. So please find them online. It is ServPro.com. That's SERV, ServPro.com for more on that. All right, it's great to have you here on the program here today. It's Mike Griffith, special Tuesday appearance for him coming up in just a moment. We kind of got some guys sort of sliding around here a little bit. Connor's on vacation right now. Mike's on vacation a little bit later on this week. So you got a lot of that going on. So we'll be happy to welcome in Mike as a special Tuesday guest for us here today. But before we get to that, let's go around the doghouse. And let's remind you that Around the Doghouse today, presented by our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners. And I just mentioned a moment ago, a big national analyst giving Georgia a pretty big compliment, and the fact that's a meaningful point to make, that Georgia, if it has the best offensive line, might truly be, once again, the best team in the country. That might be the lever that propels Georgia to success once again here this season. I want to transition here just a bit and talk about another interesting compliment that Georgia has gotten, or in this case specifically that Coach Kirby Smart has gotten. So Joel Klatt, you may know him. He's the analyst for Fox Sports. He's sort of their version of Kirk Herbstreit, sort of sits in the big chair as the main color analyst for their biggest games, Big Noon Saturday, things like that. He's also got his own show that he does on a regular basis, and he was previewing some top games the other day, and he was focusing in on what he thinks is a very interesting storyline for Georgia and Alabama. And in doing so, gives Kirby Smart a pretty nice compliment. I want to play the clip from Klatt, and I guess if you're a Georgia fan, there is one sense in which you sort of like hearing nice things about Kirby Smart. I guess that's true. But there's also, I think, something pretty meaningful about what Klatt is saying, and I want to kind of get into that. Let's first of all hear Kirby Smart being called the new standard in college football by a pretty prominent voice, Joel Klatt. Here it is from the internet recently.
I know that Bama won their last meeting, but Georgia has won the more recent national championships, and the legend has stepped down. So this is no longer Kirby Smart as the protege against the master, Nick Saban. This is a Saban-less Alabama program. That's why this game is so interesting. I would argue that the new standard in college football, even with Michigan as the defending national champion, is Georgia. They're the program that is still intact as far as a program that is a recent national champion winner, a recent 29-game win streak. They're a few snaps away from being back in the playoff and going for a three-peat, right? Like, we know how Kirby has recruited. Kirby, at this point, I think it's safe to say, is the standard in college football.
So I think it's important to note this, and this is why I want to play this clip for you. It's kind of cool to hear Joel Klatt saying nice things about Kirby Smart. But I think it's important to understand that if that's the label that Kirby Smart is wearing in the post-Nick Saban era, this is the new standard. Think about that title, that phrase, as being like a championship belt. It has to be defended on a regular basis, because while Kirby Smart currently stands atop the perch, top coach in college football, leading the premier program in college football, there are other programs who are coming for that label. They are coming for that title. And in this particular case, Joel Klatt is talking about Kalen DeBoer, Alabama, kind of trying to be one of those teams. And in one respect, I'm sure it probably is kind of interesting for many in the national media to think about, the reversal of roles here, where for a long time it was the younger coach Kirby Smart trying to take down the older coach Nick Saban, in many respects because of the fact that, Saban's been, he's out now. Kirby Smart sort of feels like he kind of fills the Nick Saban role, and Kalen DeBoer's kind of trying to come to kind of pull away some of Kirby Smart's success. I'm sure that does seem interesting to many in the national media. But the truth is, the Georgia-Alabama game that Joel Klatt's highlighting right there is not the only game where it's going to kind of feel that way here this year. The other game a few weeks after that, the Georgia game against Texas, is going to be a little bit that way too, because Steve Sarkisian has been a head coach now at a couple of different spots for a handful of years here, but has never really tasted the success like he enjoyed in 2023. I think he's hoping that what happened last year for Texas and what happened for him individually was his chance to sort of announce his presence as now he's making a push to be college football's top coach. Yeah, maybe Kirby Smart's got a head start over him with a couple of national championships, but at a job like Texas, that's the kind of thing that I'm sure that Sarkisian believes he could easily make up that ground if he could just have some success against Kirby here right now. Perhaps Lane Kiffin feels that way. Perhaps Ryan Day feels that way if those two coaches were to be matched up once again. But it's not just the Georgia-Alabama game where Kirby Smart will be defending his status, as Joel Klatt calls him, the new standard in college football. There are a lot of coaches who would like to knock Kirby Smart off that perch. And it's important to remember this, is that, we sort of saw Saban in, like, say, the last, what do you want to say, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 years of his coaching career, where it sort of seemed like he was a man without an equal, right? Kirby Smart was just kind of coming up as a young coach, eventually besting Saban in 2021, but prior to that, still kind of in the sort of early days of himself as a head coach. And while that was the case, there just wasn't anyone who proved to have any real staying power in terms of competing with Saban. Like Ed Orgeron popped up for a year in 2019, but he sort of disappeared as quickly as he showed up. Other coaches kind of would have their moment. Jimbo Fisher talked a big game, ultimately couldn't back it up. But there were a lot of these sort of flashes in the pan that sort of showed up, seemed like they might be a threat. At one point in time, Gus Malzahn would have been one of those. Once again, sort of dissolved pretty quickly. But that recent history for Saban at the end of his coaching career sort of makes you forget that there was a point in time in which a guy like Urban Meyer was kind of thought to be Saban's equal. And the way we kind of talked about Saban as the best coach, there was a time, you want to go back to when Meyer was still at Florida, when he transitioned to Ohio State, where it was sort of thought to be Saban Meyer. There was kind of a rival to Saban status as college football's top coach. It was only when Meyer sort of fell by the wayside that Nick Saban kind of emerged as that coach who seemingly didn't have an equal in the ranks. So the point here is that's what the next couple of years in college football are going to be like. Kirby Smart trying to continue to hoard success and hoard the kind of talented players to make that success possible, and trying to prevent, I would say, a real rival for emerging the way that it once appeared that Urban Meyer might be to Nick Saban, or the way that other coaches on a brief basis try to become for Saban while he was at Alabama. Of course, one of those teams, one of those programs is Kalen DeBoer, now in Tuscaloosa with the Crimson Tide. And Joel Klatt did talk a little bit more about, why, in his mind, that game for Georgia going to Alabama is such a big deal here this season. Let's hear Klatt one more time on that.
So now all of a sudden, it's no longer Georgia trying to measure up, take down Alabama, the protege reaching after and trying to beat his mentor. It's in some ways the opposite, even though Kalen DeBoer is not the mentee in this case. Alabama will be measuring themselves against Georgia now. That's why this game is so important and impactful, and will shape not only the season, but all of college football. It will shape exactly what we think of the sport in terms of who holds the standard in the sport.
So there you go from Joel Klatt, and I think that's fascinating. And that, to me, is what this season's about, because if you're Kirby Smart and you're Georgia, if you can take this time in which it sort of seems like you're a program without an obvious rival, a program without an obvious equal, and if you can win now, given that as the circumstances, then it seems like you could create the kind of space for yourself that you could use as an advantage for many years to come. But on the flip side of that, if Georgia, for whatever reason, were to stumble, if for whatever reason were to fall short of the championship expectations here this year, that's the kind of opportunity, whether it's a Sarkisian at Texas, or as Joel Klatt points out, a Kalen DeBoer at Alabama, or anybody else who sort of thinks about themselves as ready to take that next step. If Georgia were to stumble this year, you create the space for one of those true rivals to emerge. That, to me, and I've said this to you before, is the most fascinating storyline for the upcoming season. Really, really interesting to see if Kirby Smart, who's now being viewed by Joel Klatt and others as the real standard in college football, can the season end with that still being viewed to be true? If it can, and if that's what's happening, then Georgia could be about to go on a run that could last for many, many years to come. And that is Around the Doghouse, presented today by Georgia Safe Retirement Planners. And obviously the conversation we're just having about Kirby Smart made possible in part because Nick Saban is now enjoying his retirement. And if you want to enjoy your retirement maybe as much as Nick Saban's about to enjoy his, our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners can help make that possible. Now, the truth is they may not be able to help put as much money in your account as what Nick Saban's going to have in his, but the same way I'm sure that Coach Saban's got retirement goals, things like that. Guess what? Your retirement goals can be achieved there as well when you have that consultation with our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners and talk about exactly what retirement can look like for you. Obviously, you deserve a comfortable retirement. That is what our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners wants to help you with. They're going to give you a truly free, no obligation retirement planning services conversation, sort of help figure out how you get all of that. There's no upfront risk to you, which is an important part of this because that's really what the word safe means when it comes to all of this. You get the peace of mind knowing that financial security is possible for you. You can also generate up to 50% more retirement income at a fraction of the cost you might get with other service providers, and you never have to worry about outliving your savings in retirement. So our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners, they kind of understand what how the future and financial changes in the future could impact you and all of this. So they want to help guide you in the future and help kind of set the stage for you to have many, many years of financial freedom and enjoy the retirement you deserve. So please find them online. It's GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com. That's GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com, and you can schedule your free, no obligations consultation. It's great to have Georgia Safe Retirement Planners bringing Around the Doghouse to us here today. All right. Before we are done on today's program, we have new reasons, if you're a Georgia fan, to possibly be mad at, as we like to call them, those lousy, stinking Gators of Florida. We'll tell you about that before we're done. But for now, on everything going on with the Georgia Bulldogs as the summer rolls on and the Dogs get ready to, not too many weeks from now, start fall camp, let's talk on a special day to our buddy Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Happy to have Mike Griffith as part of the program here today. Not his normal day. Kind enough to join us here on a Tuesday. Mike, let me address a couple of the issues we were just discussing, then we'll kind of find out what else is going on with Georgia here today. We're talking about Kirby Smart, Joel Klatt, Fox analyst, calling him the new standard in college football. And I think you and I have talked about this before. I mean, in the post-Nick Saban world, that's a relatively easy thing to say, but there are other coaches who would like to have that title for themselves. And there is, I think, this thought that there is a sort of a level of success and kind of a perch top of the sport that's perhaps sort of up for grabs here a little bit because of the long track record of success that Nick Saban enjoyed. Kirby Smart seems to have that right now because he's won he's won a couple of national championships here recently. But there are other coaches who think they could pretty quickly get their program to that level that Georgia has been on. And, that to me is the storyline here for this year. If Georgia wins it this year, then you may see a setup where Georgia has kind of a gap between itself and the other programs where it can mean even more success in future years. But if Georgia were to give back some of that perceived advantage here this year, if Kirby Smart himself were to give back the distance between himself and whoever the next best coach in college football is, then all of a sudden Georgia might kind of find itself in a much more ferocious competition moving forward where it truly has some equals perhaps kind of emerging either in the SEC or on the national landscape as well. That, to me, is sort of the storyline for this upcoming season that I find the most fascinating.
Well, what I find fascinating is how perception overtakes reality, Brandon. I mean, I can only think of one program that's had 3 straight regular seasons where they've been undefeated. I can only think of one program that's won 2 out of the last 3 national championships. So people can say what they will about Nick Saban, but I think it's been a minute since he's won a national title, right? 2020, am I right? Am I missing one?
Yeah.
Okay,
that's right.
So I have a hard time saying that somebody that hasn't won a national title in 4 years is on top of the sport. Jim Harbaugh won 1, and it was somewhat tainted with the Spygate issue throughout the year. I think Kirby Smart's been the standard since 2021, Brandon. So I think there's a false premise out there. I know it's a convenient premise for ESPN since they've hired Nick Saban and he's going to be their broadcaster on the weekends. But what I see on paper in terms of what program has won the most at the highest level, both in the regular season and in terms of national championships, produced the most number of NFL draft picks, and still maintains the highest level of continuity on their coaching staff and on their team, with a projected number one overall draft pick and a Heisman Trophy favorite. I think I would just back up and say I think the premise is wrong that Kirby wasn't the premier coach before Nick Saban retired. Even though I know Saban beat him last year 27-24, Sarkisian beat Saban by 10 points in Tuscaloosa. And then, of course, Brent Venables beat Sarkisian. So I don't think it's as simple as saying who won head-to-head. I do know the history between Nick Saban and Kirby, and I don't think Kirby rightly took the mantle until they took him down in the national title game, 33-18. But again, we're looking at a program that's won 2 out of the last 3 national titles, that's laced together 3 straight undefeated regular seasons, and that set an SEC record with 29 straight wins and produces the most amount of NFL draft talent year in and year out.
Well, I would agree with that. When Kirby kind of emerged as a national championship coach, I think he became the top coach in college football. I think the point is that moving forward, it's sort of hard to stay there. That, no one, whether it be Sark or even Ryan Day or some of these guys, perhaps even Dan Lanning, these coaches that sort of think of themselves as aspiring to be at that level, I think they're probably just as hungry as ever. And being the top coach, it's not a static situation. You have to go out there and defend that status in order to remain the top coach. And obviously, Georgia fans, I think rightly so, are confident in Kirby's ability to do that. But it's still a challenge to stay there, that you may be the top coach, but there's no guarantee that 5 years from now that'll still be what you are, because we do see, mobility within these rankings, over the course of time.
Well, the good news, bad news of the transfer portal is that the roster is very fluid. And so it's not a lot of the same guys coming back. It's a lot of guys that haven't done it yet. Carson Beck hasn't done it yet. Carson Beck's legacy is in the balance. I don't think I know that Georgia, and it's obvious from you and I that we're looking at it from 10,000 feet and saying they need to defend. As far as Kirby's concerned, the risk board has been wiped clean of the pieces. There is nothing to defend. There is nothing that this program owns. What happens this year will determine where Georgia is. There's no carryover from last year. Now, maybe in the preseason polls and things like that, but we know how meaningless those can be. So I think the first thing to take note of that gives Kirby and Georgia the opportunities is their mindset is different than ours, where we'd say, oh, well, they were, top 5, they got to defend. They don't defend anything. They start over every year. And that mindset is very important, that every day is a new day over there. And it truly is that way. I mean, it's somewhat militaristic with the level of discipline that they have, with the goals that they set, and with the clear message that what you did last year doesn't mean anything. Like Kirby talked about Nazir and Warren coming back and the interior defensive line. Hey, don't come back just to come back. These guys have something to prove this year. So I guess I'm getting philosophical with you, but I think it's very important, because I think the reason teams don't repeat or don't continue their success is they develop a level of complacency and that attitude that they have to hold on or defend, whereas Georgia stays in this attack mentality and wipes the slate clean, and Kirby challenges them every year and says, look, last year was last year. Y'all ain't done nothing yet.
I was talking before you joined us. I think maybe the most important thing that Georgia could have going for itself here this season is the fact that it's once again being projected to possibly have top offensive line in the country. And anything that Georgia wants to do offensively, I believe, is made easier when you're talking about the offensive line, the caliber of what Georgia might have. And to me, this is also especially important when you look at a team like Ohio State, who we kind of think of as maybe the top challenger for Georgia this season. Georgia's going to be preseason number 1. Ohio State's almost certainly going to be preseason number 2. But there is a big perceived gap between the quality of these two offensive lines. Ohio State's offensive line thought to be nowhere near as good as Georgia's. Teams that Georgia's playing this year, like Ole Miss and Alabama, once again, the quality of those offensive lines perhaps not thought to be at the same level of what Georgia's is. Texas is thought to have a very good offensive line, but these other big games that Georgia's playing, big perceived, difference between the two offensive lines here. And so if you're a Georgia fan, you kind of want to lean on what might be your biggest advantage here for this upcoming season. I think offensive line is a pretty important aspect of this overall program to circle. Do you agree with that?
For sure. I think it's solid. You got a first or second round left tackle protecting Carson's blind side. You've got a road grader and Tate Ratledge firing off the right side at guard. You got a guy like Xavier Trustback, an experienced veteran guy. A lot of talent inside between Dylan Fairchild and Michael Morris. One of those guys is going to win. Super athletic center. I'm with you. I think the offensive line is great, but I would throw caution when we talk about teams that are replacing starters and projections. After all, Brandon, it was just a couple years ago when Georgia lost 15 players to the NFL draft and another 13 out of the two deep in the transfer portal. And how in the world could Georgia be as good? Well, they went undefeated, despite losing more talent than any collegiate team in history. That's documented. Nobody talks about this. I don't know why. I guess they don't want to give Kirby credit, but that was the biggest loss of talent that any collegiate football team had suffered in in collegiate football history. And Georgia went 15-0 after that. So what I'm suggesting to you is that Ohio State has capable players, and they're in a conference where they can have a couple of off weeks and still win games, much like Texas did last year. They will get better as the year progresses. So I'm not ready to, when teams bring guys back, I think we automatically assume they're gonna be better, or that in some way there's a value to that. And certainly when we talk about continuity, we do say that in most cases that's a really good thing. But I remember talking to an SEC football coach in the 90s and I said, well, so-and-so has so many back. He said, well, yeah, well, how many of those guys are donkeys? He said, if they ain't any good, doesn't matter if they're coming back. It ain't going to be that much better than they were a year ago. And likewise, just because someone's new, like I would suggest, Brock Bowers moving on. I've got a story on the website right now where Carson Beck discusses life after Brock Bowers. And you sit back and you say to yourself, they're going to have to replace him with some guys. Well, you're bringing in a guy from Stanford. We don't know his upside, and we know that Oscar Delp has gotten better and better, and we know that Lawson Lucky flashed incredible potential before the ankle injury last September, and we know the Riddell kid is a guy that even Kirby Smart called out. So I'm not here to suggest anybody's going to be as good as Brock Bowers, but what I'm saying is just because they've lost that guy at that position doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be effective there. So I'm with you. All we can do as prognosticators is look at what's on paper in front of us, and everything you say is absolutely correct as we play the guessing game and the likelihood game. But I leave room for improvement in programs like Ohio State that recruit effectively, like Georgia, between what they did between 2021 and 2022, certainly does not get enough praise and credit. But yes, it starts on the line of scrimmage. And I think Georgia is very strong offensively and defensively with what they have coming back. And I really like the edge, Brandon, that I heard from Carson Beck in that interview. I think that as Carson goes, this team's going to go.
So I want to finish kind of on a similar topic with that, because one of the things we had some fun with yesterday is that, and there's a part of me that wants to be fair about this and not like make too much of it. But like Texas, a rival of the SEC thus far, they're sort of acting exactly the way you expect Texas to act. Both Steve Sarkisian and Quinn Ewers have both said something to the effect of, we know we're going to be everybody's biggest game every single Saturday. And that just sort of feels like a very Texas thing to say, because, obviously a show like this, we talk about Georgia, and it's actually Georgia who's won a couple of national championships, and it's Georgia who, theoretically ought to be everybody's biggest game, but you don't really hear Georgia talking that way. Instead, you hear Carson Beck saying what he said at the Manning Academy, which is, yeah, we're going to go out there and we're going to be the hunter every single week. We're not going to be hunted. And we talked yesterday about how at least the public statements from Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck on that particular topic, very, very different. Ewers sort of sounding a little bit like Sarkisian. Beck sounding like what we heard Kirby Smart say at SEC Media Days there in 2022. And admittedly, we might be making a little too much out of it. I guess, perhaps that's the case. But it was pretty easy to draw a contrast between the mindset of Georgia and the mindset of Texas based on some of the things that we've heard from these two programs here in recent days.
Yeah, and I would rather be on the Georgia side mentality-wise.
Me too.
For forever. Texas has been able to talk a good game and back it up simply because they have incredible resources. And, huge advantages. But if you go back and look at their schedule last year, I think they had 5 games that were decided by 10 points or less. I think they needed overtime to beat Kansas State. I think they lost to Oklahoma. I think that a 10-point win over Iowa State doesn't excite me. And yet they got in because of that early season win when Nick Saban did such a terrible job with Jalen Milroe. They didn't even know how to use him. They had to bench him the 3rd game of the season. I'm still amazed that people continue to gaslight this as one of his best coaching jobs when he didn't have his starting quarterback settled until halfway through the year and needed to score on a miracle play to beat Auburn. But I digress. That is the narrative. That is a convenient narrative, and a lot of people will echo it. It's the company line, if you will. Texas can talk big all they want. All I know is they're going to have a rivalry game the week before they play Georgia. And that's a team that they're going to have to get up for because Oklahoma beat them last year. And it'll be really interesting to me to see if Texas can get up 2 weeks in a row. Now, the SEC did give them a very favorable schedule. I think they play Mississippi State in their SEC opener. I think Vanderbilt is on their schedule. I think really Georgia and Texas A&M are probably the only 2 teams they play. I think Florida also plays them. But I think Georgia and Texas A&M are the only 2 teams they play that really have the talent to beat them in a 7 out of 10 or 6 out of 10 scenario. So they're in a good place right now. It's good for the league that everybody's talking about Texas and Oklahoma. It expands the audience. It brings more television sets. It brings more potential advertisers. They can talk all they want. This is going to be settled on the field on October 19th.
Mike, fascinating stuff. We appreciate you being here. We know you got a little vacation time coming up, so we appreciate you making some time for us today on a not normal day for you, as Connor Riley enjoys some time off there too. So we'll let you step away from work here for a few days. As you mentioned, you got a lot of stuff there at DawgNation.com that we'll read over our Independence Day holiday. And, of course, we'll catch up with you back soon again, right back here on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. Mike, thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thanks, Brandon.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, interesting conversation there. And we mentioned this, as Mike was alluding to. I think the general consensus is that Texas was given a fairly favorable schedule by the SEC, either as luck would have had it or whatever, whatever reasons you want to ascribe there for that. Texas seemingly has a little bit of an easier schedule than some teams do as they enter into the SEC. But as we mentioned this on our RS Andrew School Down yesterday, Texas does play Oklahoma and Georgia in back-to-back weeks. That's a pretty significant 2-week stretch. So even with a kind of perceived to be somewhat favorable schedule, there are still some landmines to be had, and playing OU and UGA in consecutive Saturdays is certainly an example of all of that. All right, with that said, let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here today. And obviously, the response has already been amazing. Utopia of the Seas will be the ship that we sail on for our 4th DawgNation cruise coming up here in 2025. I'm lucky enough in just a couple of weeks, and I'll be telling you more about this, obviously, as we get closer, but in just a couple of weeks, I get my own chance to be on Utopia of the Seas. Enjoy that. Come back and tell all of you about it. And then we're all going to be on there coming up in April of 2025, so go ahead and make your plans. Now, here's what you need to understand. Utopia of the Seas, incredibly popular ship. We knew that by making this the ship for our DawgNation cruise here this year, we're going to have the challenge of kind of securing enough space for obviously the size of cruise that we all get a chance to take together. So we were able to kind of secure some of the best staterooms on board Utopia of the Seas at a special rate. Now, there's only a limited number of those rooms, and we have already signed up so many people for this DawgNation cruise. So that's exciting, but it's also, for you to understand that if you want to be with us in April, and if you want to see Perfect Day Coco Cay and the best that Utopia of the Seas has to offer, if you want all of that, the time to do that is right now, not too soon to start thinking about April of 2025. So I want you to go to DawgNationCruise.com. That's the website. You can see a link to get right there to it. You can also reach out to Jessica Slater directly because she is the travel agent, specially selected for us by Royal Caribbean to help us with our DawgNation cruising needs. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She's the one that's helping us plan our DawgNation cruise. It's time now to get going on all of that. All right, let's do a couple of stories here. Let me start with a recruiting note here just for a moment. There is a 4-star linebacker out of Wayne County set to make his college decision here today. That's Tavian Wallace. I think the thought here is is that Wallace is likely not to choose Georgia. I believe, and I don't want to spoil the surprise, but I believe the expected leader here might be Florida State. So if Wallace chooses Florida State today as expected, and I guess that Georgia's still a factor here, and who knows, maybe something happens late or something like that. You never know, I don't guess. But if Wallace goes the way of Florida State, then it could set us up for kind of what's next for Georgia at the linebacker position. Obviously, that's a position we've already seen Georgia get a big win with earlier this cycle with Zayden Walker. And then, you then kind of see sort of what happens after that. I think the expectation today is that Wallace is going the way of Florida State, but there's also some rumblings and grumblings that what was a busy June for Georgia kind of shifting into also a busy July. The dog could be back in the commitment conversation here again very soon. I think the expectation is not with Wallace here today, but perhaps with others in the very near future, but we'll keep our eye on it. We'll see. And we're just trying to, as these recruiting storylines drop on a daily basis, kind of make you aware of the kind of the ongoing process there on that. The next big thing to happen with the 2025 class is today, where Georgia is theoretically kind of a hat on the table here, but probably not expected to win when it comes to Tavian Wallace. So we'll keep our eye on that. Also, as I told you a moment ago, I think if you're a Georgia fan, you have new reason today to be a little angry with those lousy, stinking Gators of Florida. So there's a story at CBSSports.com in light of the new SEC expansion, ranking the top rivalries in the SEC. Now, before I get to the Florida part of this, let me give you just a brief opinion about this, because this is what we do this time of year in talking season. We take people's lists, we criticize those lists, and then we kind of make our own list. But so Will Backus at CBSSports.com, ranking the SEC's top rivalries, has Oklahoma and Texas at number one. Cannot tell you how much I disagree with this. You know, I've been a big college football fan my entire life, not just the SEC. That's my favorite league, of course, but the rest of college football there too. And, I think that Oklahoma-Texas obviously a, significant game, and, clearly has a little bit of a cool cachet because much like Georgia and Florida is always in Jacksonville, Oklahoma and Texas is always at the Texas State Fair. But, the idea this is a better rivalry than like Egg Bowl, which I think is probably actually the SEC's biggest rivalry, even though the fan base are a little smaller, or the Iron Bowl, I simply don't buy that. And this is the kind of nonsense I think we're going to have to put up with a lot, where people are so enamored with what's new in the SEC right now and kind of falling over themselves to say, oh, man, Oklahoma and Texas, already the SEC's biggest rival. At this point in time, both Oklahoma and Texas are barely even SEC schools. They're still in their infancy when it comes to this. And so let's kind of hold off on calling this, a huge, gigantic rivalry when, at least in comparison to the other SEC rivalries, let's let them do something to earn that before we make too big of a deal on that. They need to make an impact on the SEC, in other words, before they can have the SEC's biggest rivalry. But when you look at the list from CBS Sports, this is the point I'm getting to about Florida, is Oklahoma, Texas clearly has a spot on this list, whether it's the top spot or not. Then you get to the Iron Bowl. Then you get to the Egg Bowl. And so now you have a situation where the Georgia-Florida rivalry is now only the fourth biggest rivalry in the SEC. Many of you remember this. It was only a couple of years ago, and this is one of those things where I guess you got to give Dan Mullen a little bit of credit, which seems like a weird thing to say, but I guess you got to give Mullen a little bit of credit that when Mullen was at Florida, when he's stirring the pot and getting people fired up and things like that, you had guys like Paul Feinbaum and others who were on a very regular basis saying that Georgia-Florida was the biggest rivalry in the SEC. We've played these clips for you before. And there were other kind of media types who were kind of saying the same thing. Feinbaum was saying, hey, if I want to generate calls, and essentially that's all the Paul Feinbaum show is he sits there and takes calls and somehow gets paid to do it. But if Feinbaum said, if I want to generate a bunch of callers, if I want to create, a hysteria on my show, it used to be Iron Bowl, it used to be Auburn, Alabama, now it's Georgia and Florida. Like only a couple of years ago, that's what Feinbaum was saying. And now, at least according to one dude, Will Backus from CBS, Georgia-Florida is now only the fourth best rivalry in the SEC. That the prestige of this rivalry has fallen, seemingly theoretically because the lousy, stinking Gators are just so lousy and stinking. Now, we mentioned this the other day as it relates to Georgia and Georgia Tech, that there's always going to be a little bit of, a what do you call it? Like a contradiction here, because on the one hand, like, you don't want your rival to be good, but if your rival is good, it theoretically makes your rivalry a little bit better and a little bit more prestigious. So the kind of weird byproduct of the success of Georgia is that all of a sudden former rivalries are either less prestigious than they used to be, or in some cases non-existent. In Florida's case, Georgia will always play Florida, but the rivalry doesn't feel very big right now because Florida is incapable of competing with Georgia, at least seemingly, and that would appear to be true for years to come here. So Florida's inability to compete has now made the rivalry overall less prestigious. But you also have a situation here where the number 5 rivalry on this list, according to CBS Sports, is Georgia and Auburn. And look, this is one of those deals where in future years, Georgia and Auburn, at least as assuming the SEC maintains an 8-game conference schedule, which right now it appears they probably will, if Georgia and Auburn, are going to be a part of a league that plays the 8-game conference schedule, then this rivalry game is not going to be played every year anymore. And you get the impression, based on some of what the Auburn people are saying, they're sort of just fine with that. So in the case of Georgia-Florida, you got a situation where the rivalry is less prestigious. In the case of Georgia-Auburn, Georgia's been dominating Auburn for forever. Auburn seems kind of okay with, not playing Georgia every year anymore. Now you got a situation where the Georgia-Auburn rivalry, if you're not careful, is going to be non-existent. All because Georgia is so much better, at least for right now, than the team on the other side of this rivalry. So it's sort of a weird time here. We obviously don't agree with the CBS dude that Oklahoma and Texas, the SEC's best rivalry. That's pretty dumb. But it is a rivalry now in the SEC, and it has a place on a list like this. And whatever place you put it in moves some of the other rivalries down. And right now, some of Georgia's most historic and, frankly, rivalries that I've kind of defined my life by are on the verge of just feeling less either prestigious in the case of Georgia-Florida or almost non-existent in the case of Georgia-Auburn because of how much better Georgia is than these formerly hated foes, or still hated foes, but perhaps the same level of emotion, more difficult to conjure up just because of how one-sided this fight is here for right now. It's truly kind of a reminder of what kind of a glory day age we're living in here for UGA, that once hated rivals all of a sudden now are almost becoming afterthoughts. Impressive to think about the success that Georgia's put together. And that is cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. All right, before we wrap up here today, let me give a shout-out to our friends at the Finish Long Drink, because I got to tell you, man, I love being outside this time of year. Coming up on that 4th of July weekend, that's pool, that's lake, that's beach, that's back porch. That's just something, being outside and enjoying the summer and doing everything you can to try to stay cool. And boy, you better believe that an ice-cold can of the Finish Long Drink helps you do that. You get your cooler, you put the Finish Long Drink down at the bottom of that cooler, you pack the cooler full of ice, and then when you're ready to kind of reach in there and dig down deep and pull that out, when you bring out that can, just sort of glistening with the condensation that comes as the cold liquid just sort of, and water from the residue from the ice just sort of drips down the side, you know you're about to be refreshed and ready to go here this summer, whether it's the Long Drink Cranberry, the Long Drink Strong, 8.5% alcohol by volume, Long Drink Zero, no carbs, no sugar, the traditional in the blue can with the grapefruit flavor and the gin kick. Whatever your favorite choice is. One of our Golden Shoe winners of the day showed us that Long Drink, the peach flavored version, and the peach state for a limited time. Just a great time to enjoy the Finish Long Drink. It comes in a can, sort of looks like a beer, but it's not. It's a ready-to-drink cocktail. And in this really fun category of beverage, there is no beverage in that category that tastes better than our friends at the Finish Long Drink. So enjoy some this summer, and you can find out where you can pick some up online at thelongdrink.com. That's thelongdrink.com for more on that. As we say goodbye to you here today, let's give you a golden shoe. One of our buddies, Georgia on Tap, sent this to me. I guess there's an Instagram account that's doing like some fancy bulldog art or something like that. And Georgia on Tap says there's Bulldogs and there's the University of Georgia Bulldogs. Am I right, DawgNation Daily? Yeah, you better believe that is the case. But I got to tell you, the Bulldog is truly a stately-looking creature, right? Stately-looking creature, stately mascot. Not as big as, like, say, Bevo from Texas or Ralphie from Colorado or like that big Razorback thing from Texas. Like, there are live animal mascots that are larger but none that project more of a stately image, just a sort of, a wisdom, I mean, there's just something about that Bulldog mascot. George on tap, exactly right about that. And we'll give him a golden shoe for saying just that. Lousy, stinking Gators. Part of the reason the rivalry matters less than it used to is because it's been 1,333 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. The truth is that rivalry's going to keep, I should say that number's going to keep going up, and perhaps the perception of the rivalry keeps going down as it does, but maybe Georgia fans are just fine with all of that. That's our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They will show up on time. They will do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. We may not go incredibly long with comments today. We'll honestly judge to see what kind of mood some of you are in. If you're fired up and, all about it, we may stick around here for a little while. But if we're in kind of a summer cadence, then we may let y'all sign off and enjoy that too. Let's see what else. By the way, Mark Woodmansee says, don't give up on Tavian Wallace just yet. He's from Jessup. We do not let those young dogs go without a serious fight. So there you go, Mark. We'll hold on to that. We'll hold on to that for sure. Paul Moon says, anything interesting on the podcast today? Well, hopefully so. Hopefully so. Frank Patterson says, I'm 100% okay with Florida and Auburn being terrible and making the rivalry weaker. So there you go on that. I would probably agree with that. Sacred Grove says the same thing. I'll accept the prestige of the rivalry being as low as possible as long as that means that Florida's bad. Yeah, so strong take there from Sacred Grove. Let's see what else. Johnny Surf Dog says, I really feel good about this roster going into the season. Fifth-year quarterback, talented and deep offensive line group. All three defensive groups ridiculously loaded, strong everywhere. Plus, it's a revenge tour year. Johnny, I believe I agree with you on almost every point there. I really do. P. Rich says, honestly, I see how everybody thinks Alabama's going to fall off, LOL. I think he means I don't see that because they're not going to be an easy team to beat, in my opinion. As we've gotten closer to the start of the season, P, I've kind of come around to what you're saying right there, is I think that I was a lot more likely to disregard Alabama come January, February than I probably am here in like May, June, July. And part of the thing I keep circling back to is if you care about like blue chip ratio, their percentage of former 4- and 5-star recruits is still pretty high. It was not a great recruiting class for Kalen DeBoer in his first year, but the overall recruiting talent on the roster is still pretty high. It's a head coach that does have college football playoff experience. That was it with Washington last year. It's a starting quarterback that also has college football playoff experience. That there are 12 teams making the playoff. You're going to have a hard time finding, 12 teams that on paper that have more going for it than it seems like Alabama's getting right there. That's not a word. That it seems like Alabama has got right there. I kind of agree with you here. That in a weird way, I sort of think Alabama has actually been a little undervalued coming into the year. And at one point in time, perhaps undervalued by me. I don't know that I necessarily am doing that anymore. So I'm probably kind of right there with you on that. In other words, if we say that Texas is the biggest game of the Georgia schedule, I believe that it is there any disputing that Alabama is the second biggest game of the Georgia schedule? Is there any disputing that? More so than Clemson, more so than Ole Miss. I would say that's the case. And if there is a game on the Georgia schedule that's not getting enough attention right now, I'd say it's probably Tennessee. I think there's a reconsidering of Alabama a little bit, and perhaps there ought to be at least a little bit of a reconsidering of Tennessee a bit too. Because who was it we talked about the other day that was like down on Ole Miss? Who was that was saying that? We had this on the show the other day. And who knows if that's true or not. Many of you have accused me of being excessively negative towards Lane Kiffin. Perhaps I have been. I'm always open to that everybody's got their sort of perceived biases. Maybe I've got a little bit of a blind spot when it comes to Lane Kiffin. I at least have to be honest about that. But I wasn't the one who said this at the time. But if it is true that a team like Ole Miss, too transfer laden, is Bud Elliott, blue chip ratio, is kind of a little bit skeptical of Ole Miss. that if that ends up being true, then somebody also has a chance to be better than their perception would suggest. And if Nico is the guy for Tennessee, maybe they are that team. Well, let us see what else. Mike asking about the schedule. Yeah, so it's Texas against Oklahoma in the State Fair, and then the following week they come back home to play Georgia and Austin. So there you go. I think the full weight of that would be felt more so if they were having to go on the road to face Georgia. They probably get a little bit of a mitigation against the back-to-back because the game is in Austin. But that's still two tough back-to-back opponents. Let's see what else. Sacred Grove also brings up a good point. The 40 years of ups and downs was truly humbling. We know better than anyone how not to win before we actually win. Yeah, you can't celebrate victories before they occur. Sacred Grove's right about that. Sacred Grove is right about that. I think that's also a really important point, too. I do think it's an important point. P. Rich also says he believes that Alabama is hands down the most important game on the schedule. Once again, I sort of see how you would arrive at that point if you're kind of operating from the theory of the magnitude of the Georgia-Texas game isn't fully achieved unless Georgia beats Alabama, because it does come earlier in the season. I could kind of buy into that. Oh, George on Tap says the Instagram of the Bulldog is he's doing an agility contest and he's hauling. Well, there you go. Impressive stuff there from the Bulldog. Thank you, George on Tap. I'm not always the most sophisticated guy, so sometimes I need extra explanations. Good to see Cassie Turner in here today saying that the Bama game is a huge one. Indeed, it is. Let's see what else. DT says Georgia and Missouri, they both have a really easy schedule. I don't think I'd say that Georgia has an easy schedule, but Missouri is one of those teams who are thought to have a little bit of a schedule break because they don't play Georgia, for one of the things. Randy Hall and K-Dog kind of making the comparison between Dylan Bell and Debo Samuel. Boy, that'd be nice to think about. DT also wondering if Dylan Bell is the forgotten man. Well, listen, I mean, we were kind of saying this about him at the end of last season, that if anybody has a chance to take that sort of massive leap, Bell might be that guy. Scott Harris also saying that Florida was good back in the 90s. He said, let's keep it that way with that success kind of in the past tense. I like that. Scott Harris also brings up an important point that on the subject of whether or not Texas and Oklahoma could rightly be considered the SEC's biggest rivalry, if you're going to try to be as objective as you can possibly be, I mean, it's not even obvious that Oklahoma is Texas's biggest rival because, the passive-aggressive nature of Texas and Texas A&M, the fact that they, have fought so hard not to play each other for such a long time. You can't tell me that the average Texas fan hates Oklahoma more than he hates Texas A&M. I just don't believe that's the case. I just don't believe that it is. And when I was a kid, and I realize now, me being a kid, it's kind of a long time ago. When I was a kid, Oklahoma's biggest rival was Nebraska. Oklahoma, Texas was a game that was always played, but it was really Oklahoma and Nebraska. Like I'm talking about a child in the 80s when I was a child, first kind of falling in love with college football. Oklahoma and Nebraska was thought to be the biggest of the games, not Oklahoma, Texas. And, Texas's big rival was Texas A&M. So, once again, not even being like the SEC homer of who are these new, teams to come in here and try to, whatever. Like, just trying to, I love college football. I love Georgia, but I love college football. As someone who loves college football, I've never really considered Oklahoma, Texas to be kind of a top-shelf rivalry in comparison to others because there is a little bit of a divided passion there in terms of, who you would actually view as your biggest overall rival. I think Oklahoma, Texas was made bigger because of its presence within the Big 12. Randy also says, can you believe I'm already quoting on flights for basketball season? Yeah, time goes by, man. One year just rolls right into the next. It is amazing, Randy. Amazing. Roger All points this out. He goes, I live in San Antonio. All my in-laws are Aggies. Texas absolutely hates A&M more than anyone. Of course they do. Roger, you're absolutely right about that. And, the fact they've worked so hard not to play each other and the thought that the one program didn't want to help the other program by playing it, like that's the stuff of real rivals, right? That's the real rivalry stuff. And, there are every now and then there are these moments in college football when you realize, because in some cases, it's like the fans that hate each other, but the institutions are kind of fine. They view each other as sort of business partners more than anything else. But every now and then you get a situation where the actual institutions sort of hate each other, and that's when the real rivalry stuff happens. And I'd say in the case of Texas and Texas A&M, there's a level of institutional hate there that is authentic and genuine. And for the rest of us, pretty fun. Let's see what else. Scott Harris mentioning the anger about the Longhorn Network when it first came around. Ultimately, a lot of that ended up sort of being not that big of a deal, right? But Scott's absolutely right about this. When the Longhorn Network first came around, especially, I guess, for the other Big 12 teams, it was especially true, but even like over here, there was this thought of, who is Texas to get its own network? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Amazing how much that kind of stirred people up, at a time in which, like, we're sort of pre-social media, right? But we're very much in what I think of as kind of the blog era for college football. A lot of the stuff around college football at the time was sort of driven by blogs. Maybe that wasn't pre-social media. I guess it wasn't pre-social media. But there was still kind of a large blog culture around college football. They were kind of driving the opinions. And Texas getting the Longhorn Network at the time was viewed as a very big deal, for sure. Let me go to Facebook for a moment. The same type of thing kind of reminds me of, do you remember when people were talking about full cost of attendance? Do you remember that? That, certain schools were going to be able to give a little extra money as a scholarship, and they were, going to, which seems totally fair to me, that, making sure everything you need while you're in college is completely paid for. And, like, there were some teams, like supposedly Auburn and others, they were going to be especially aggressive with what they were offering as their full cost of attendance. And that was sort of thought to be this huge recruiting advantage, things like that. And one of those deals we made a huge deal about and ultimately ended up not being all that consequential, which would perhaps suggest that some of the stuff that we're also kind of hand-wringing over right now, maybe some of this stuff ends up not being that big of a deal too. I guess it's a possibility, but I think you still got to stand on guard. Kent Holcomb says UGA repeatedly gets voted as the best mascot in college football. Yeah, you love that. You love that. William Camacho says the 3 SEC teams that need to be on our schedule every year, Florida, Auburn, and Tennessee, in my opinion, which I think a lot of people agree with. It's kind of funny, though. Georgia, Tennessee, if you want to have the perspective of decades here, is actually a relatively new phenomenon in terms of being a rivalry. That prior to the 90s, Georgia and Tennessee actually didn't play that much. Seems crazy to think that, but they didn't. That almost the sum total, because, like everybody remembers the Bill Bates game in 1980, and then Georgia obviously blew out Tennessee in 1981. But the two teams didn't play again until 1988. That almost the sum, other than the Herschel, game in 80, almost the sum total of Georgia's history with Tennessee is like 1990s and beyond. Now, most of us can't remember anything before the 1990s anyway, but like Georgia and Florida, I mean, their history robust in the 70s and the 60s, going back to the 1940s. Like, there is a long list of history between Georgia and Florida, Georgia and Auburn there as well. Tennessee and Georgia, even considering themselves rivals with each other, is a relatively new phenomenon when you think about the century-plus history of the SEC. Zach Adams wants to play Alabama every year because he wants to straighten out that all-time record. There you go. And there's obviously the old story about why Georgia and Alabama didn't play more frequently than they did, which I feel like I know part of that story. I don't know that I know the full story and all that. Craig Hill going back to those great Munson calls from that 1980 Georgia-Tennessee game. Marshall Fleming says Alabama's going to have its hands full with Wisconsin on the road to begin the season. Wisconsin's very good at home and below average on the road, plus Alabama's a 3-touchdown Worst team playing without the SEC ref. So there you go on that. Yeah, you got a couple of these SEC teams playing these early season non-conference games that are going to shape a lot for us. In fairness, you got to put Georgia Clemson on that list. Let's see how Georgia handles its business against Clemson. Alabama going on the road to Tennessee. Texas going on the road to the defending national champions, Michigan. I don't think Michigan's going to be very good this year, but that's also a pretty interesting game, too. LSU week 1 against USC. There are some pretty interesting non-conference games that could sort of Texas A&M and Notre Dame. That's a pretty big game. Notre Dame, I think, a team nationally we haven't talked nearly enough about. A&M trying to be something in year 1 of Mike Elko. That tells you a lot, too. You've also got, A&M and Miami there as well. So pretty good early-ish season games in the SEC here. There's also that point where my body, we talk about this stuff every day. But when we start talking about it with the mindset of now it's getting a little closer, it just sort of feels a little different to my body. I don't know if you ever noticed that or not, but the whole thing just sort of feels like a different conversation once you realize that now we're talking about this with the real sense that we're getting a little closer to this being true, which I kind of like. Greg Baker says the Dawgs' most heartbreaking loss and its greatest victory both came against Alabama. You may be right about that. That's pretty interesting. You may be right about that. That is a interesting thing to consider. Randy Hall says, how many current football magazines do I have now? So I actually still haven't bought the Athlon magazine. And the honest truth is I'm not sure I'll buy the Phil Steele. I'm actually not that – I hate to say this because it seems like he's a little bit of an institution. I am actually not that big of a fan of the Phil Steele magazine. But the Athlon magazine I want to get eventually. The truth is I haven't had much of a chance to read much lately. Roger Hall says he looks forward to the Aggies underwhelming once again against Notre Dame. I hate Notre Dame far more than the Aggies, but it's going to be true, I fear. So there you go, Roger, weighing in there. All right, a couple of other comments. We're going to wrap it up for today. Let's see what else. Paul Moon says, I didn't really start watching until 2002. We were playing Clemson regularly. I liked that rivalry. Yeah, when I was a kid, you could make a case that Georgia-Clemson was at the time it sort of felt, I don't want to say it was Georgia's biggest rival. That's saying it wrong. But it felt like the biggest game on the Georgia schedule. It really did. It really did. This is also a time in which, when I was a kid, the SEC was only 10-team conference. And you only played 6 conference games. So an 11-game regular season schedule, only 6 of your games are conference. So it's almost like a high school football schedule where, you're playing essentially half your games against non-conference foes. So Georgia played usually a good number of ACC teams every year. Always played Tech, always played Clemson. It played Duke and Virginia. Just kind of sort of a weird thing. But yeah, the Georgia-Clemson game was a very big deal. Very big deal. Frank Patterson pointing out if your school has 2 mascots, they don't actually have 1. Frank, I would agree with you on that. Let's see what else. Good to see Texas Dog checking in today. He certainly knows what it's like to live amongst those Aggies and Longhorns and people like that. G. Gray says there's no difference in UGA and the Miss-State mascot. Is it Bully? Is that what he's called? Man, I ain't never seen Bully in no movie. I ain't never seen Bully on the cover of Sports Illustrated. That's like saying, me and Sydney Sweeney are the same because we're both humans. It is not the same. Let's see what else. Paul Moon says, we used to be the GOATs. Now we are the GOATs. The acronym spelling. Yeah, I guess that's true that Georgia was the GOATs for a while or something like that. I guess that is true. Cassie Turner also pointing out that Bully has brown spots. That's exactly right. Cassie, you're right once again. All right, let me go to the other comment sections here. DT says the 30-0 blasting of Clemson, this is 2003, was one of my favorite games I've attended. My Clemson grad buddy tried to, a little overconsumption there at the end. Yeah, first of all, one of the hottest games I've ever attended. Clemson was always fun because it was easy to drive up there. This is back when they had like the aluminum bleachers like Georgia used to have, where like the visiting section was kind of all kind of partitioned off together. Ooh, boy, was it hot that day. And it was rough. It was rough on me for sure, because my pregame consumption habits far different then than they are now. Almost got myself into some trouble that day. Very, very hot. Very, very hot. Craig Hill says, I think we were the GOATs until we brought the coach in from Yale and adopted the Bulldog mascot, which is kind of interesting. Marshall Fleming says the Butler Bulldogs are becoming pretty famous. Yeah, they got the great Hinkle Fieldhouse. I love that. I love that spot. That's the same venue that the state championship game in the finale of the movie Hoosiers takes place. That's Hinkle Fieldhouse there for that. So I like that. All right, we're going to get ready to go. Anything else before you leave? Good stuff as always. I think there's a spammer in Facebook right now, so y'all be careful with that. Baruch Dog says my all-time favorite game I attended was the 1991 Clemson versus Georgia game. We beat them on the same night the Braves clinched the playoffs. It was a fun night at Sanford. I totally remember this. I remember this so well because, like, when the Braves won the NL West, which is the division they were in 1991, that was a massive deal. And then that night, Georgia hosting a top 10 opponent was also a really big deal as well, and Georgia won that game. There's also the moment in which, like, the Redcoats were kind of leading the chop, and the Georgia fans and the Clemson fans were doing it together because obviously that part of South Carolina is very much in Braves country. That was a special night. Am I right to say that was the single best moment in the Goff era? Is that right? Is there a bigger win for Goff than that? I sort of don't think so. That was a really fun night. A very memorable moment for me. Very memorable moment for me. And, like, that's during a time in which, like, college football and just sort of sports in general were the absolute biggest thing in my life. Absolutely the biggest thing in my life. I remember that so well. So well. Yeah, Scott Harris also kind of remembering the Dogs fans, the Clemson fans sort of doing the chop together. A big deal. I remember it so well. Roger Hall mentioning Greenville. Yeah, Greenville's kind of a cool town. Like he says, the only bad thing is proximity to Clemson. Greenville, this is not like an ad, but Greenville, underrated place. I would say underrated place for sure. All right, we're going to go for now. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. So this 4th of July week, don't be stuck in a hot house. It's not keeping you cool and comfortable. Let our friends at RS Andrews help take care of you there. You can get your air conditioning unit tuned up, and it might only cost you $99. Find them online for more on that. rsandrews.com. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you then.